On the afternoon of June 19th, 1993, a man in his late 60s was enjoying a round of golf with three of his friends. His name was Pete Roberts, and as he looked for his ball near the tall trees at the edge of the course, he couldn't help but smile. An emerald green fairway was spread out in front of him, lined with trees and dotted with clear blue ponds. He thought it might be the most beautiful golf course he'd ever played on, and he could play on it as often as he liked, which came in handy because Pete actually was not very good at golf and wanted to improve his game. A few years ago, Pete and his wife Nancy had moved to Fairfield Glade in eastern Tennessee. It was advertised as a retirement community, but to them it felt like a vacation resort. There were hiking trails, tennis courts, and best of all, 5 world-class golf courses, all within walking distance from their house. They'd made lots of new friends, too. Fairfield Glade was full of people just like Pete and Nancy, folks who had worked hard throughout their entire lives, and now they just wanted to enjoy life and relax. Pete carefully lined up his club and prepared to take his shot. But as he stared down at his ball nestled in the grass, he started to feel lightheaded. He staggered a bit to regain his balance, and his friends saw that something was wrong with him. So they grabbed him by the arms and shoulders, making sure he didn't fall down, and then they guided him over to the golf cart so he could sit down. As Pete sat in the cart sipping on water, he wondered if maybe he'd just gotten too much sun. Fortunately, the dizziness spell passed after only a couple of minutes, and then they all headed back to the clubhouse. A few hours later, Pete was grilling steaks out on his deck. He and Nancy had some neighbors over for dinner, as they often did on Saturdays. Pete chatted with his friends as he flipped the steaks over one by one, until the dizziness returned. On top of that, his head was starting to ache, so he carefully made his way inside and took some aspirin. But it didn't make much of a difference. During dinner, Pete barely touched his food, and he was in such a fog that he struggled to make conversation. By the time everyone went home, Pete was really feeling rough, like every muscle in his body was aching. Nancy thought he might be coming down with some kind of flu, so she sent him off to bed in the hopes that he'd sleep it off. By the time Nancy got into their bed a couple of hours later, Pete was fast asleep, but she noticed his breathing sounded unusually deep and heavy. She considered waking him up to make sure he was okay, but decided it might be better to just let him rest. She turned off the light on her bedstand, made a mental note to call Pete's doctor first thing in the morning, and then she drifted off to sleep. Just before dawn, Nancy woke up and realized that Pete's side of the bed was empty. She got up and immediately noticed a crack of light under the bathroom door. She thought Pete must have been using the toilet, but she still wanted to make sure he was okay, so she knocked softly on the door and called for her husband. But Pete didn't answer. She knocked again and waited, but again there was no reply. Nancy started to worry. She turned the knob and saw the door was unlocked. But when she tried to open the door, she realized it was blocked by something inside the bathroom. Nancy could sense that something definitely was wrong here, so she pushed even harder, but still the door wouldn't budge. And so she shoved again and again with all of her might, and the door cracked open a few inches. She kept pushing, and finally she was able to squeeze her head through the opening, and when she looked down, she could see her husband had collapsed on the bathroom floor. Nancy's heart began to pound. She summoned more strength and forced the door open enough to wriggle her whole body inside. She grabbed Pete by the shoulders, screamed his name, and splashed water on his face. He seemed to be breathing, but no matter what she did, he just would not wake up. Nancy finally ran out of the bathroom to the phone and called 911. A short time later, a little after 6 in the morning, paramedics arrived on the scene and were immediately concerned. Pete had a high fever, a dangerously fast heart rate, and his skin had a bluish tint. The medics wasted no time. They loaded Pete into the ambulance and sped to the nearest hospital. Around the same time, a doctor in his early 30s named David Stenson was in his office at the Cumberland Medical Center getting ready to pack up and go home. He had been assigned to work the overnight shift that weekend and was looking forward to grabbing a bite to eat on his way home before getting some well-earned sleep. But as he locked the door to his office, a nurse ran up and told him a new patient named Pete Roberts had arrived in the emergency room and needed Dr. Stenson's attention immediately. Dr. Stenson changed course and ran to the emergency room where he saw Pete getting rolled inside on a gurney. Dr. Stenson rushed over to examine him. Pete was still unconscious and his vital signs were at critical levels. His kidneys were failing and now he had fallen into a coma, so Dr. Stenson knew he had to act fast. The bluish tint to Pete's skin was a clear sign that his blood oxygen levels were dropping. Dr. Stenson decided that Pete needed to be put on a ventilator, which is a machine that pumps oxygen into a patient's lungs. The doctor carefully inserted a tube into Pete's mouth and carefully pushed it down his throat all the way to the bottom of his windpipe. Once the ventilator was powered up, Pete's condition immediately started to stabilize as oxygen flowed directly into his lungs. With that crisis averted, Dr. Stenson picked up a file folder and started reviewing Pete's medical history. As he flipped through the pages, Dr. Stenson couldn't see any underlying health issues that would make Pete this sick. Pete had always been a bit on the heavy side, but by and large, he was a healthy guy. There were no pre-existing conditions or red flags that the doctor could connect to Pete's current condition, but Dr. Stenson was determined to keep looking. 30 minutes later, the doctor was scanning x-rays of Pete's chest. His lungs looked like solid white blobs. This meant that they were full of fluid instead of air, which explained why Pete's oxygen levels were so low when he arrived. Dr. Stenson feared that the fluid meant Pete had a disease called spinal meningitis, which is a bacterial infection that spreads extremely fast along the spinal cord to the brain. It could kill Pete in less than 24 hours if it wasn't treated right away. Dr. Stenson rushed back to Pete's bedside. He was still unconscious, so the doctor and his team carefully rolled him onto his side. They pulled up the back of Pete's shirt, and the doctor slowly inserted a long syringe needle deep into Pete's lower back, all the way into his spinal cord. This procedure was called a spinal tap, and it enabled the doctor to extract fluid from Pete's spine so that it could be tested for meningitis or other conditions. If the fluid came out of Pete looking clear, that meant Pete did not have spinal meningitis. But if the fluid looked yellow and cloudy like lemonade, it was a sure sign Pete did have it. Dr. Stenson held his breath as he extracted the spinal fluid into the syringe. And when he looked at it, it was totally clear and had no color. The doctor let out a sigh of relief. Pete did not have spinal meningitis. But there was no time to relax. Pete was still in critical condition, and Dr. Stenson had to keep searching for answers. It wasn't until the afternoon, 8 hours after Pete's arrival, that a clue started to emerge. While Dr. Stenson reviewed the results of a blood test, he saw that Pete's white blood cell count was much lower than it should have been. The results surprised Dr. Stenson. Normally, white blood cell counts were elevated when someone was fighting an infection, but in rare cases, certain infections could also decrease someone's white blood cell count. That was helpful information, but Dr. Stenson still had no clue as to what was causing this infection. As the hours passed later into the evening, Dr. Stenson felt stumped and totally exhausted. He couldn't help but wonder if his hospital just was not equipped to deal with a case like Pete's. It had been over 24 hours since Dr. Stenson had last slept, but even though Pete was stable for now, Dr. Stenson didn't want to go home. So, a little after midnight, he kicked off his shoes, laid down on the couch in his office, and tried to get some rest. He hoped that once he got a little sleep, Pete's condition would start to make more sense to him. But when the doctor woke up early the next morning, things only got stranger. While grabbing a cup of coffee in the break room, Dr. Stenson learned from one of the nurses that another patient had just arrived in the emergency room. His name was Tom Parkin, and he also lived in Fairfield Glade, the retirement community where Pete was from. Tom was so sick that he could barely walk, and his symptoms were identical to Pete's. Tom's white blood cell count was low, and there was fluid building in his lungs. What's more, just like Pete, Tom's medical record showed that he was healthy with no pre-existing conditions that could explain this new illness. Over the coming days, Dr. Stenson ordered additional blood tests on both patients, combing through the results as he tried to figure out what was infecting both of them. But then, on Saturday, June 26th, 6 days after Pete arrived at the hospital, the crisis escalated again. 2 more men from Fairfield Glade arrived at the emergency room, and they too had the same symptoms as Pete and Tom. One of the new patients was in critical condition. The hospital staff did their best to stabilize him, but just a few hours after arriving, he slipped into a coma. Now, Dr. Stenson and his team had a new understanding of how quickly this mystery illness could escalate. But even though this emergency was growing, the doctor started to feel a glimmer of hope. Earlier that morning, he had received the results from a blood test he ordered the day before, and it revealed what the patient's white blood cells had been fighting. It was a bacterial infection called ehrlichiosis that coursed through the bloodstreams of its victims and wreaked havoc on their immune systems. On one hand, this was good information to have, but on the other hand, it created more questions for Dr. Stenson. Ehrlichiosis was extremely rare. The first known case of it had been reported just 6 years earlier, and only around 60 cases had been reported in the entire United States during the previous year. But here, in this tiny retirement community of just 3,000 people, 4 cases had emerged in less than a week. To Dr. Stenson, what was happening in Fairfield Glade seemed statistically impossible. Thankfully, Dr. Stenson learned that the disease could be treated with an antibiotic called tetracycline. He administered it to all 4 of the ehrlichiosis patients, and it didn't take long for them all to get better. But Fairfield Glade was still in significant danger. Ehrlichiosis was extremely dangerous and progressed at a rapid pace. Dr. Stenson knew that if he couldn't figure out what had caused this outbreak and stop it from spreading, that people were surely going to die. So he made a call to Atlanta, to the headquarters of the Center for Disease Control, and requested their assistance. The CDC agreed with Dr. Stenson's assessment and quickly put together a team led by one of the nation's greatest experts on ehrlichiosis, Dr. Reed Gerhardt. Over the next few weeks, Dr. Gerhardt and his team made 10 trips to Fairfield Glade. They studied the area and interviewed residents, they collected samples, and ran extensive tests across the community, both indoors and outdoors. And sure enough, they found the bacteria that causes ehrlichiosis was present in the environment, but only in highly remote areas. Dr. Gerhardt still didn't know why so many people were coming in contact with this bacteria or how to stop it. As Dr. Gerhardt and his team were working through the data, the epidemic was spreading. By the end of the summer, 2 months after Pete Roberts was hospitalized, 7 more ehrlichiosis cases had been diagnosed in Fairfield Glade. And so now Dr. Stenson was treating 11 different people for this illness, and he couldn't help but notice that they were all connected by another quality. All of them, except for one, were men. The ehrlichiosis crisis continued to intensify. Dr. Gerhardt and his team were unable to find a clear answer in the data they had collected over the previous weeks, so the doctor decided to review older research. He dug through every medical journal he could find, looking for possibilities, but found nothing. And then one day, he happened across a battered, yellowed copy of the New York State Journal of Medicine from 1947. It was nearly half a century old, but as he scanned through one of the articles, he stumbled onto something that was very interesting. Moments later, he was on the phone talking to Pete Roberts, the very first resident of Fairfield Glade to get hit with this disease. Dr. Gerhardt had just one question, and it was not about any of Pete's symptoms. It was about Pete's golf game. What Dr. Gerhardt learned in that phone conversation finally cracked the case wide open. Because Dr. Gerhardt was not just an expert on ehrlichiosis, he was also an expert on bugs. And Dr. Gerhardt knew that ehrlichiosis was spread by one bug in particular. When he'd first arrived at Fairfield Glade, Dr. Gerhardt had set to work figuring out where that bug was hiding. The community was bordered on one side by an 80,000-acre nature preserve with miles of walking paths. The preserve featured dense woods that were full of deer, raccoons, bears, and bugs, including the bug that he knew was the culprit. Before that phone call with Pete, Dr. Gerhardt hadn't understood how that bug could be causing this outbreak. For people to get bitten by this bug, they would need to trek off the well-groomed trails and into the bushes and grass where the bug was hiding. From what he was observing, the senior residents of Fairfield Glade were not doing that. But then, as the summer wore on, Dr. Gerhardt discovered yet another connection between all the ehrlichiosis patients. Almost all of them were golfers. And after his phone call with Pete Roberts, he finally understood these golfers were bonded by yet another critical factor, one that explained everything. When they teed off, these golfers had a very hard time centering the club as they swung it down to drive the ball down the fairway. Instead of soaring the ball in the direction of the hole, the ball would shoot diagonally off of their clubs and bounce off into the rough, which is the tall grass that surrounds the main part of the course. In warmer months, these golfers would often be wearing shorts, so when they marched into that tall grass to find their errant ball, their bare legs were easy prey for this bug that was lurking there. A bug called the Lone Star tick. This tick got its name because the adult ticks have a tiny white spot on their backs that's sort of shaped like a star. These ticks were very small, only 1 to 3 millimeters wide. They were so tiny, in fact, that the golfers felt nothing when the bugs bit down on their legs and started drinking their blood. But then it was too late. The ehrlichiosis bacteria the ticks were carrying entered the golfers' bloodstreams and started waging war on their immune systems. The 1947 journal article that Dr. Gerhardt found was written almost 40 years before the first known case of ehrlichiosis. But the article was relevant to the doctor because it talked about how other tick-borne illnesses were spread. What caught the doctor's attention was that the article concluded that tick-borne disease was a risk for golfers, but it was a much greater risk for bad golfers because they often would have to trek off into the rough. This was what the patients at the Cumberland Medical Center all had in common. Their golf scores were terrible, and all of them were spending way too much time out in the rough with the Lone Star tick. All 11 of Dr. Stenson's patients who were stricken with ehrlichiosis eventually recovered from their symptoms. With the cause of the infection now identified, Dr. Gerhardt set out to reduce the spread of the disease at Fairfield Glade. The number one prey of the ticks were the deer that resided in the surrounding nature preserve. So Dr. Gerhardt and his team developed a method of lacing corn with ivermectin, which is a drug that kills parasites. The deer that ate this corn were totally unaffected by the drug, but the ticks that drank the blood of those deer were all killed. Within months, the tick population in Fairfield Glade plummeted by 85%. Still, to this day, golfers at Fairfield Glade know to put on a healthy layer of bug spray before hitting the links, especially those with a weak game. Here is our second story called The Stranger. On a summer afternoon in 2014, a 78-year-old man named Leo hobbled up the steps to his apartment in the city of Tours, which is in central France. It was a humid day, and Leo was eager to get inside and take a nap. But the moment he opened his front door, something just felt wrong. Leo couldn't quite describe it. Everything in his apartment was exactly as he left it, but there was almost a presence in the place, like he wasn't alone. He called out, asking who was there, but nobody answered. He did have an adult daughter named Colette who lived nearby, and she did have a key, but he knew she would not come over without calling first. As quietly as possible, Leo picked up the cane that he left in an umbrella stand by the door. He raised it over his shoulders, ready to strike anyone who might lunge at him. And just the thought of doing that made his heart start to race. He was an old man. He could barely keep the cane from wobbling as he held it in the air, and so he wasn't sure how well he'd do defending himself against an intruder. Leo quietly reached down and put his hand on the entryway closet and quickly swung it open. But the closet looked undisturbed. Leo closed the door, then scanned the living room and kitchen, but they were empty too. And then when he went into his bedroom, it was still dark and totally untouched, and there was no one hiding behind the doors or under his bed. He told himself that he had to be alone, but somewhere in the back of his mind, he just didn't feel right. He just couldn't shake this feeling that there was somebody else in this apartment. Leo set his cane back into the umbrella stand, and then he headed to the bathroom to wash up, hoping that maybe some cold water on his face would get him to stop feeling so on edge. Leo opened the door, he flicked on the light, and then immediately he cried out in alarm. Because there, just a few feet away from him in the bathroom, was a grown man with cold eyes and a brooding look on his face. Leo stumbled backwards into the hallway with his back flat against the wall, and while he was there, he just stared at the stranger. He was old, with a weather-worn face and gnarled hands. His back was slightly curved, but Leo could tell from the man's wide shoulders that he still had a lot of strength left in him. "Who are you?" Leo stammered, but the stranger didn't say. Instead, he only promised not to hurt Leo. Leo could hear the sound of his own heart thumping in his ears.
He knew there was a phone on the counter in the kitchen just a few feet away, and so he had to reach it. Slowly, Leo inched towards the phone, never taking his eyes off the strange man in the bathroom. But the stranger suddenly barked at Leo to stop, and Leo froze against the wall, his eyes still fixed on the stranger. The stranger begged Leo not to call the police, and at that moment, Leo saw a shift in the old man's eyes, from sort of cold to now pleading. And Leo started to get the feeling that whoever this guy was, he really didn't mean any harm. Maybe he just got lost and was confused about how he got here or where he was supposed to be. So Leo decided he would not call the police. He tried to coax the stranger out of the bathroom by inviting him into the living room, but Leo could immediately see a spike of panic in the old man's eyes. He kept saying, No, I'm fine right here, I'm fine right here. So Leo told him, okay, that's fine, don't worry about it. Leo just wanted to keep the stranger calm while he figured out what was even going on here. And so with his eyes on the stranger, Leo slowly continued backing his way down the hallway with his back to the wall, and as he did, he felt around with his lead hand until his hands found one of the lightweight wooden chairs in the kitchen. He grabbed it, again his eyes still fixed on the stranger, and then he dragged the chair back down the hallway until it was in front of the bathroom, and then he put the chair right down in front of the door, and then he looked at the stranger who was in the bathroom, and he told him to take a seat on the closed toilet lid. And to Leo's relief, right as Leo sat down, the stranger did too, and so suddenly the whole situation felt much more diffused. Leo then asked the stranger a few questions, like how long he lived in tours and whether he had a career when he was younger. And to Leo's surprise, the man opened up, telling Leo all about his childhood and his love of cooking. Leo told the man that he too liked to cook, and right away the stranger's eyes lit up. He launched into an explanation of all of his favorite recipes, telling Leo about his special tricks to get each one just right. Leo had to admit that he actually found talking to this old man very pleasant. For a moment, he almost forgot that this man had broken into his apartment. Then, a loud car horn sounded outside the window, snapping Leo to his senses. He realized the afternoon was growing late, and he really needed to get this stranger out of the apartment and back to wherever he belonged. He asked the stranger if anybody was expecting him for dinner that night. But for the first time, the stranger just didn't respond. His eyes filled with sorrow. Finally, he admitted to Leo that no, he and his wife had long since divorced, and nobody expected him for dinner these days. Leo frowned. He knew how the man felt. His own daughter was grown up and out of the house. It got lonely cooking for one so often. Leo sighed, and against his better judgment, he actually asked the stranger if he'd like to stay for dinner. And right away, the stranger's face brightened, and he said, yes, I'd love to, and he thanked Leo repeatedly. And then Leo asked if he'd like to help make dinner, since he loved cooking so much. But the stranger became agitated and repeated that, I really feel more comfortable in the bathroom, so I'm going to stay here. Leo said, okay, yeah, no big deal, that's fine, you can stay here. But secretly, Leo felt very unsettled by this. Why didn't he want to leave the bathroom? It didn't make any sense. Is this guy really okay? Is he mentally unwell? Like, what's going on here? And it was at this point that the reality of the situation that Leo was in really came back to him. I mean, there is a stranger who broke into your house who will not leave the bathroom. And Leo had no idea what the stranger was even capable of, and he's just now invited him to dinner. But without much else to do, Leo simply said, okay, I'm going to go make dinner now, and he left the hallway and headed to the kitchen, and he busied himself making a brie and tomato tart, but the whole time he never allowed himself to fully turn his back to the bathroom. He wanted to make sure at all times he at least had some line of sight on where the stranger was. But the whole time Leo was in the kitchen staring at the bathroom, the stranger never left the bathroom. He couldn't even see the stranger anymore. And then anytime Leo walked over to the bathroom and peeked his head in, he would see the stranger just standing there next to the sink, not doing anything. 40 minutes later, Leo served dinner in the bathroom because the stranger, again, would not leave the bathroom. As for the stranger, when he received the food, he acted like this was totally normal. And if Leo was being honest with himself, he was kind of glad to have this guy here. He liked having the company, even if the company was pretty odd. And so the two men chatted and had their meal together, and then after they were done, Leo was pretty tired and ready for bed, and so as gently as he could, he told the stranger that it was now time for him to leave. But the stranger refused and said, nope, I feel good in the bathroom, I'm going to stay here. Now Leo was starting to get frustrated, and he said, no, really, you have to leave right now. But again, the stranger, just as calm as can be, said, "Nope, I'm gonna stay here." Finally, Leo just got mad and practically yelled at this guy to get out of the house now. But the stranger grabbed onto the sink, adamant that he would not go, and he told Leo, "This is my home. I'm staying here." Leo was totally outraged. He had been nothing but kind to this man, and now his patience was totally gone. But when he shouted yet again at this man to get out, the stranger's eyes suddenly went cold. That brooding face returned, and he became aggressive. The stranger shouted that this was his apartment and he was not going anywhere, and he began to pace back and forth beside the tub, warning Leo to leave him alone or else. It was at this point that Leo realized he could not solve this by himself, but he still felt bad about calling the police. He was convinced this stranger was just confused. Leo didn't think he deserved to be arrested. So Leo just started slowly backing away down the hallway away from the bathroom, keeping his eyes fixed on the bathroom in case this guy came running out. And then eventually, Leo reached the kitchen where he was able to reach his phone, and he grabbed the receiver and dialed the number for his daughter, Colette. And then when she picked up, he told her everything that was going on, and she told him she would be there as fast as she could. A few minutes later, Colette was parked outside of her father's apartment. She bounded up the stairs and flung open the front door, and her eyes landed on her father, Leo, who was pacing in the living room looking totally upset, and Leo would say that the elderly stranger was in the bathroom. But when Colette checked, the bathroom was empty. Colette moved quickly from room to room looking for the stranger, but there was no sign of him. She figured he must have fled her father's apartment in the short time it took for her to drive over here. So Colette rejoined her dad in the living room and tried to calm him down, telling him that, the stranger must have left and they'd just changed the locks in the morning and everything would be fine. But Leo still seemed really upset, and he just kept pacing around in the living room. To Colette, it seemed like her dad wasn't even listening to her. She put her hands on his shoulders and forced him to stand still, and slowly his eyes did focus on her and his shoulders relaxed. But while Leo did seem to now be more calm, when he began to speak again, Colette became very worried, because her father was talking about the stranger and how upsetting it was that they were here. However, what he was really upset about was actually the stranger's manners, not the fact that the stranger had broken into his apartment. Leo kept saying, how rude it was for someone not to leave when they were asked to leave. And Colette kept telling her dad, that doesn't really matter. He's gone now, and that's the most important thing. Remember, he broke into your house. This is someone who probably is not very polite. But Leo, he just could not let go of how rude this stranger was. And so slowly, as Colette listened to her dad rant about the stranger's poor manners, something about the story just started to feel wrong. Like the way her dad was talking about it just didn't seem like a normal reaction to what had just happened. And so acting on impulse, she grabbed her dad's jacket and ushered her dad to the door and told him they were going to the hospital to make sure he was okay. A few hours later, Colette sat down next to her father's bed inside of the emergency room. It was after midnight, and the doctors had run a full course of tests, including blood work and an MRI. They also had given Leo cognitive and memory tests, and now Colette and Leo were anxiously waiting for the results. Finally, a physician parted the curtains by the bed and walked into the room, and he told Leo that physically, he was basically fine. All of his tests were normal, except for a small damaged area near the base of his brain where a little pocket of connective tissue was missing. The doctor told them that it could be a sign that Leo had early-stage Alzheimer's disease, which causes the loss of memory and cognitive function. Colette felt the blood drain from her face. Alzheimer's is a fatal disease, and she wasn't ready to lose her father to it. But the doctor assured her that it was still too early to know for sure if he had it, and even if he did, the doctor said treatment options now were better than ever. Just in case, the doctor said he was prescribing Leo 2 anti-anxiety medications that are frequently used to treat the symptoms of Alzheimer's. And the doctor said he would keep Leo in the hospital overnight just to make sure he was okay. Moments later, a nurse entered the room with a small water bottle and a little plastic cup with 2 white pills inside of it. After Leo swallowed both pills, it didn't take long for him to relax. Leo promised Colette that he'd be totally fine at the hospital by himself, and she should just come back in the morning. So Colette thanked him and kissed him on the cheek, and then she headed home to get some sleep as well. The following morning, Colette headed back to the hospital, and Leo had just been discharged, and so she was able to collect him and get him out to her car, and then she drove him back to his apartment. And when they got to the door and they opened it up, Leo very cautiously stepped inside, and for a second he tried to see if he had that same feeling he got the day before, when he felt like there was somebody in the apartment, and sure enough there was. But as Leo stood there right now, he didn't get that feeling. The apartment felt empty. But Leo still felt like he just had to check the bathroom. And so with Colette right behind him, Leo slowly made his way to the bathroom. He opened up the door, he looked inside, and he sighed with relief. The stranger was gone. A few days later, when Colette and Leo returned to the hospital for a follow-up visit, when they went into the exam room, the doctor came in and told Leo that he had some news. They had discovered something that explained why that stranger was in Leo's house. The doctor told Leo that he was suffering from a neurological condition called Cagras syndrome, which prevents people from recognizing familiar faces. Leo thought a stranger was in his bathroom, when in reality, it was actually someone he knew very well. The doctor admitted that he had never seen a case like Leo's, where he could recognize all the people around him except for this one particular person. The doctor said that maybe the combination of Cagras syndrome and early-stage Alzheimer's contributed to Leo becoming so confused about who was in his apartment the night he came to the hospital. But before the doctor could even finish, Leo said he did now recognize the stranger for who he was all along. Leo's own face in the bathroom mirror.
In 2014, Alan Ruby was a 19-year-old freshman studying political science at the University of Oklahoma. Despite being relatively modest and soft-spoken in person, on social media, he projected this lifestyle of wealth and grandeur. He'd oftentimes post pictures of exotic sports cars and expensive watches and clothes, and he would travel the world to Paris, London, New York City, and take all these pictures showing off this incredible life he had. He really wanted people to believe that he was this fabulously wealthy, successful guy. Alan was only able to project this phony lifestyle on social media because he was spending his father's money. His father was a successful businessman who was also the publisher of a newspaper that was quite successful, and so Alan would just spend his money, and then even after his father would give him money, Alan would steal his credit card and additionally rack up thousands of dollars of credit card debt. But as media began to shift away from print media to almost all digital, a lot of newspapers began to fail because they weren't able to transition to digital. And his father's newspaper was not making that transition very well, and they were losing money left and right. And so Alan's father told everybody in his family, with a focus on Alan, that we all need to cut back on our spending because money's tight right now and it's unclear if it's going to turn around. So we got to be careful with how much money we do have. Alan acted like he was going to cut back on his lavish lifestyle, but in reality, he wasn't going to. He was totally addicted to spending money and giving off this vibe that he was so wealthy and successful. And so around this time, Alan steals his grandmother's credit card and secretly leaves the country and goes to Paris to have this vacation on his own. He's taking these pictures in front of the Eiffel Tower and he's spending all this money. And his father finds out that he's stolen this credit card and he's furious. And instead of waiting for Alan to come home and saying, don't do that again, he decides he's going to send him a message that he's going to remember. And he calls the police. Alan gets charged with theft. He pleads guilty and he has to go before a judge who sees that he has no criminal record. So he kind of goes easy on him. And he says that you need to pay back all the money you spent to your grandmother. And you need to go to an addiction program to try to break this habit of yours, to stop spending all this money. After Alan leaves court, his father felt like he finally got the message. It seemed like it had finally gotten through to him that this was a really big problem, and he felt like he had made the right decision in calling the police. But in reality, Alan hadn't changed at all. As soon as he got back from court, he was stealing from people outside of the family, he was taking loans from loan sharks, all of this just to keep up with his phony appearance he portrayed on social media. On October 9th, 2014, Alan owed $3,000 to a particular loan shark and had no way of paying it back. So instead of asking his parents for money, which for him would have been too embarrassing, he decides the best course of action is to kill his entire family. And so he strolls into his home and he shoots his mom dead, he shoots his sister dead, and then he waits for his dad to come home and he shoots him dead. Because his big plan is, with his whole family gone, he's going to become the sole heir to the family's estate, and that will be enough money to not only pay off this $3,000 debt, but have a little left over so he can go on vacation to Paris again. So after he's committed this horrible crime, he leaves his family where they are. He goes and takes the surveillance footage from inside the house. It was on a DVD, takes the DVD out, takes the murder weapon, leaves the house, chucks the DVD and the weapon into a lake, and proceeds to drive to Dallas, where he checks into a very fancy hotel and meets up with friends and parties the whole weekend. His friends that were with him that weekend would later tell investigators that Allen seemed totally normal. There was no red flags. There was no indication that anything was wrong. He was just laughing it up and having a great time that whole weekend. The following Monday, when Allen's father doesn't show up for work, the police are notified. They go to the house and they find the Ruby family. When police went out and got Allen and brought him back to the station to chat with him and tell him what happened and see if he knew anything, his sad reaction to his whole family now being deceased was apparently so insincere that officers almost immediately assumed that he was probably the guy that did it. Ultimately, Allen would confess, and the prosecutor wanted to push for the death penalty, but Allen's remaining living family members actually said, "Don't do the death penalty. We don't want to risk that not happening. We want to see justice served right now. Can we create a plea agreement where he gets life in jail, but there's absolutely no way for him to get paroled, no matter how good his behavior is, no matter how old he is, no matter what, he can't ever get out of jail." And so they did. They created that plea agreement. They gave it to Allen to sign. He signs it, and as they're walking out of the courtroom, his last remaining family members disown him and say, "May God have mercy on your soul," and they leave. This is the picture that Allen uploaded to his Instagram account just hours after killing his entire family. They're all lying on the ground in his house at the time this picture is being taken. He's in this fancy hotel room with his friends, and the caption reads, "College wouldn't be half as fun without these two peaches. #BestFriends." 2014, the United States Navy decided it was time to decommission one of their old frigate ships, and so they sent it to a dock to be broken down for scrap. In order for workers to actually be able to access the underside of the ship and actually begin to break it down, they would need to dry dock the ship, which meant the ship would basically drive into this special locking corral where the doors would shut behind it, the water would drain out from underneath, and the ship would be left resting on these huge wooden blocks that elevated it off the ground. And with no water in there, workers were able to get underneath the hull and could access every part of the ship without obstruction. It's important to note for this story that when a ship is in dry dock, there is only one way on or off. It's this ramp called a gangway that leads from the dock onto the deck of the ship. Besides that, there is nowhere else for you to get on this ship. And if for some reason you really wanted to get on and couldn't use the gangway, you could in theory try to run and leap from the dock to the ship. There's a pretty significant gap there all the way around, but you could try the jump. But if you weren't successful at grabbing onto the ship, you would fall multiple stories, probably to your death, because there's no water in the dry dock. So this old frigate ship that was being decommissioned was officially dry docked in July of 2014. The first group of people that went on board the ship to begin dismantling it were military personnel. They were in charge of removing all of the sensitive equipment before civilians were allowed to go on board. The military personnel begin to wrap up, and it's getting late in the day, and they tell the foreman, who's in charge of all of the civilian workers that are going to be going on and finishing this decommissioning of this ship, they go to the foreman and they say, "Hey, we're done, we're wrapped up for the night, your workers are good to go, they can get on here tomorrow." The foreman would send a message to his boss that night, letting him know that they were on track to start work the next day. The boss would respond and say, "Hey, can you go on there tonight and take pictures of all the different workstations so we know how many people that we need to place in different segments of this big ship?" So the foreman walks onto the ship and proceeds to take hundreds of pictures all over the inside of the ship. Now, the ship itself was pitch black inside. There was no electricity, and it was nighttime. So he had a flashlight the whole time, but whenever he took a picture, he would turn his flashlight off and then use the flash on his camera before going back to his actual flashlight. So all night he's going room to room taking all these pictures, and at some point he realizes he's photographed everything he needs to. So he leaves, he goes back to his office, he uploads the pictures, and he sends them to his boss. His boss wrote back almost immediately and just said, "Who's the guy with the axe?" Now, the foreman has no idea what he's talking about. He was just in the ship by himself for a couple of hours and didn't see anyone. So he reads the email again to make sure he read it correctly, and he sees that his boss has actually attached
the picture he is referring to. Here is this guy clearly clutching an axe in a hallway that he was just in. And even creepier is the foreman is looking at where this picture was taken, and it was relatively early on in his photo shoot. And he had walked past the exact area where this guy is poking his head out of, which means the whole time he was down there, this guy with an axe was there with him. They review the security footage of a camera that was aimed directly at the ramp, the one entrance in and out of the ship. And from the time the foreman left, no one else left. So they don't know how he got on or how he got off without being detected, but somehow he did. One night in the early 1950s, a little boy named Issei Sagawa was having this dream where he and his brother were being boiled alive to be eaten. Sagawa says when he woke up, he immediately began fantasizing about what it would be like to be on the other side of that, to be on the outside with a human inside of the pot that you're boiling, that you're going to eat. And he became totally obsessed with the idea of eating another person. By the time he was in first grade, he would find himself staring at his different classmates' legs, and his mouth would be watering because he wanted to take a bite out of their leg. For 3 decades, he was able to suppress that urge, but in 1981, those cannibalistic urges would get the better of him. One summer day while he was in Tokyo, he saw this woman that he wanted to eat, and he couldn't help himself, and so he began following her down the road, and he saw her go into her apartment. He waited for a minute, went around back, and climbed in the window, and when he got inside, she was asleep. And he hadn't thought of a plan for what he was going to do once he was inside, and so he's just standing there thinking, well, now what do I do? How am I going to eat her? What am I going to do next? And as he's sitting there wondering what to do next, she wakes up and she screams and he runs away. After this breaking and entering incident, Sagawa would actually seek help. So he goes to a psychiatrist and he says, this is what I did. I snuck into her house because I wanted to eat her. And the psychiatrist would end up telling Sagawa's family that I have to label him a high risk to society because he's not just thinking about doing these things, he's already acting out these fantasies. Now, Sagawa's father was extremely wealthy and powerful, and when he heard this from the psychiatrist, he was like, no, we're not going to do that. And so using his power and influence, he was able to kind of cover up what the psychiatrist had found, and he shipped his son to Paris. Once Sagawa landed in Paris, he enrolled at the Sorbonne University and began studying literature. Despite having sought help for his cannibalistic urges, when he was in Paris, he started having that urge again and he couldn't control it, and instead of going to another therapist or psychiatrist, he begins to look for another victim. Sagawa considered himself short, weak, and ugly, and so he was actually looking for a tall, beautiful Western woman so he could absorb their energy and somehow become a bigger, better version of himself. And so he began looking around Paris for tall, beautiful women that he could potentially eat, but no one seemed like a good fit until he met Renee Hartvelt. Renee was a tall, beautiful 25-year-old Dutch student who was going to school with Sagawa at Sorbonne. In order to get close to her, Sagawa would ask his father if he would give him some money so he could hire Renee to be his personal tutor. His father gives him the money, Sagawa hires Renee, and they strike up this working relationship together. And over time, Sagawa would build trust with Renee, they would become friends, and at some point he asked Renee if she'll actually come over to his apartment, something they had not done yet. And she's sitting in his apartment with her back turned to him. He leaves the room and comes back with a rifle, and he tries to fire it, but it jams. And she hasn't heard him do this, and so he's standing there and his weapon's now jammed. He hasn't fired it, and he just puts the weapon away and comes back out and acts like nothing's happened. And he's sitting there wondering, is this a sign that I'm not supposed to do this? But at the end of the night, when she finally left, he decides, you know what, I gotta go through with this. I have to eat her. And so the next night he gets her to come over again. He gets the rifle out when she's sitting with her back to him once again, except this time the rifle fires. Only for an instant, he felt really bad and thought maybe I should call an ambulance. But then he stopped himself and he said, you've waited so long for this. You gotta just go through with it. He immediately tried to take a bite out of her, but it was too difficult and unpalatable. So he calmly leaves his apartment, he goes to the store, he gets a blade, he comes back, and he's able to begin removing pieces of Renee so he can eat them. Over the next 2 days, Sagawa would eat most of Renee, and he would take pictures of himself throughout the entire experience. When he finally felt full, he left a couple pieces still in his freezer, but put the rest of her in a suitcase and went to dump her in a lake. But as he was wheeling these heavy suitcases around town, people saw them, and it just drew a lot of suspicion. And at some point, someone must have called the police. They show up, they ask him what's inside the suitcase, they open it up, and there's Renee. When questioned about it, he just said, I killed her to eat her flesh. Sagawa awaited trial for 2 years in a French prison, and when he finally went in front of a French judge, when the judge read the details of this crime, it seemed so crazy and outrageous that the judge decided there's no way Sagawa can be sane, and so he was deemed insane and unfit to stand trial. He was ordered to go to a mental institution where he would be held indefinitely. Shortly after that, the French deported Sagawa back to Japan, where they expected him to remain in a mental institution for the rest of his life. But that didn't happen because the French dropped his case and his documents were sealed. And when he arrived in Japan, the Japanese could not get access to his court documents, and so they did not have a case against Sagawa, and so they had to let him walk free. And so in 1986, Sagawa checked himself out of the Japanese mental institution that he had been sent to, and he's been free ever since. This is a picture of what police discovered when they opened up Sagawa's fridge inside of his apartment in Paris. This is a picture of his kitchen inside of that apartment, where you can clearly see plates and different utensils that were all used to eat Renee. This is a picture of the suitcase that Sagawa was lugging around that police showed up and asked him to open and found Renee inside of. And this is Sagawa today, walking freely in Tokyo, even though he blatantly killed and ate someone and openly admits to it and has even profited off of it. He's written books and he's been featured on TV shows. He's even been called in to be a food critic. But what's even more horrifying is that Sagawa openly says that before he dies, he's going to do this again. He can't live with himself unless he eats at least one more person. So that's going to do it, guys. I hope you enjoyed today's stories. Let me know in the comments what you thought, and I will pin the best comment at the top of the comments section. If you haven't done this already and you enjoyed today's video, please put a Kick Me sticky note on the back of the like button's shirt. Also, please subscribe